Welcome to the Living Well Church podcast, and thanks for tuning in today. Our mission as a church is to help people find faith in Jesus and a life of purpose and hope. You're about to watch a message that will challenge you, inspire you, encourage you, and most of all, point you to Jesus and the life of purpose and hope He has planned for you. So lean in and enjoy, and let God speak into your life.
Good morning. I'm just going to take you back to my first year of uni, which actually is a longer time than I would like it to be ago. And I'll just move that, sorry. And after the first year of university, I was in a halls. It was just 100 of us, and we produced a yearbook where everybody wrote in each other's yearbooks. And at the end of that year, quite a lot of people from the halls wrote in my yearbook. And I was really chuffed when I went back and I read what they said, because there was this kind of continuous theme throughout it, this like repetition of these two words, that I, get this church, was a cool Christian. And I was like, in terms of Christianity, in terms of what I felt I needed to do at university, I was like, I've had a good year. These guys think I am a cool Christian. Some of them even wrote, "You are the only cool Christian I've ever met." That made me feel really good. I was like, I'm a cool Christian. Because sometimes as Christians, we don't want to look abnormal or weird or strange. And so I was really chuffed that I'd kind of got this accolade of being a cool Christian. And it was only kind of like throughout the summer that God just kind of gently started talking to me about that I was really chuffed at being named a cool Christian. And then he reminded me of what my Christian walk should look like, of the early apostles and what their first church and their hearts looked like. And as I thought about being a cool Christian, I wondered what actually my friends really meant by that. And what they meant by that is that I was like them. That even though I was called a Christian, even though I didn't go out and get drunk, even though I didn't swear, I kept to some of the rules, actually there were things in me that was similar to them. There was a familiarity about the way I lived my life and the way that they lived their life. We shared similar aims, similar views on things like money, on success, on ambition, on relationships. And actually what they meant by being a cool Christian is they were saying, you're just like us, it's all right. And in John, it says really clearly, Jesus says really clearly, he says in chapter 15, verse 19, if you belonged to the world, it would love you as its own. As it is, you do not belong to the world, but I have chosen you out of the world. That is why the world hates you. Do you know what? And I look back and I think, man, I actually got it so wrong in that first year. Because actually I should have really aspired to be apostolic. And in apostolic, it's not like this term, this denominational term, and that's it. Apostolic actually means striving to be like the early apostles, having that heart and desire to continually love God and spread the love of God around the world, to consistently reveal Jesus to people. And if I was doing that, the world would have hated me. And so what I want to look at today as we celebrate 100 years of the Apostolic Church is Living Well Church corporately an apostolic church? Are we independently apostolic people? And to do that, I want to go right back to Acts 2, to the day of Pentecost, and just start with how it all happened, and basically do a kind of spot the difference throughout our church in the ages. And I urge you, as I do that, kind of play spot the difference with your life. So Acts 2, just right at the very beginning, when the day of Pentecost came, they were all together in one place. Suddenly a sound like the blowing of a violent wind came from heaven and filled the whole house where they were sitting. They saw what seemed to be tongues of fire that separated and came to rest on each of them. and all were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit enabled them. Just on those verses, I want to pick out a couple of things. First one is that they are all together. They are unified in one place. And we've spoken on this a lot. We've spoken on unity a lot. I'm not going to labour the point now, but I'm going to come back to it later. That very clearly, God's intention for the very first church, for the very time he sends the Spirit into them, is that they are together, that they are unified. There is a Katie King told me off for using this word last time, but there is a oneness about them. There is a one accord. They are in one mind, in one spirit. They have a heaven-sent mindset which links them all together in unity. Second thing I want to pick out is that there are these tongues of fire. I love that image of fire. You know, and throughout the Bible, God consistently uses fire to illuminate and reveal. You know, right at the beginning of Genesis, when he sends light, when he puts this big ball of fire in the sky, it illuminates the world and it reveals his majesty. And we can look at Elijah on Mount Carmel with that altar that he puts in so much water. And then God sends his fire on it to illuminate Elijah's relationship and faith with God, and also to reveal his majesty. So God illuminates the faith and reveals his glory. With Daniel and the lions, I can't speak this morning. Daniel and in the fiery furnace, you know, his friends are thrown in there, and yet they do not get burnt. It illuminates their faith in God, and it reveals his majesty. And here, there is no difference. He gives the speaking of tongues with these fiery tongues above them. And it illuminates their faith, their individual faith in God, whilst revealing his majesty. And so therefore, fire illuminates and it reveals. And I just want to stay on this a little bit, and I just want to look at tongues and home in it a little bit more. And I'm just going to flick to 1 Corinthians 14, where we get a bit of teaching on tongues from Paul. And he says, at the beginning of chapter 14, follow the way of love and eagerly desire spiritual gifts, especially the gift of prophecy. For anyone who speaks in a tongue does not speak to men, but to God. Indeed, no one understands him. He utters mysteries with his spirit. But everyone who prophesies speaks to men from their strengthening, encouraging, and comfort. He who speaks in a tongue edifies himself, but he who prophesies edifies the church. I would like every one of you to speak in tongues, but I would rather have you prophesy. Who prophesies is greater than the one who speaks in tongues, unless he interprets, so the church may be edified. What Paul says here is, I love this idea that when we speak in tongues, he utters mysteries in the Spirit. There is this illumination when you speak in tongues, where something of deep cries out to deep, and your understanding of God increases. You know, I remember when I was really young, some of my first instances of tongues. I was really privileged, and I grew up in a house where Mum didn't hold back in speaking in tongues. She'll be like taking her washing out of the machine and praying in tongues. That was quite normal for me. And I remember hearing that and thinking, what? I remember hearing it in Lynn Church thinking, what? But what I could discern from a young age, whilst my mother was taking out that washing, was was something illuminating. God was showing her something, was shining a light on something of his beautiful and wonderful character that was speaking into her heart, that was speaking to her spirit. You know, in that illumination, you could almost see from a really young age. I remember being on, I'm pretty sure it was in Lyddon Church, on my mum's lap, and I could hear the voices of tongues. I said to her, "What is that?" I was like, What is that?" And she said, "Oh, it's the voices of angels." And from a young age, I could tell that there was these mysteries being uttered between one person and another person. That there was this illumination, that God was shining light from spirit to spirit. And I also remember what then Paul goes on to say about the revelation. That one person would then have a tongue and would speak it to the whole congregation. And then another person would reveal it, interpreting it. I remember really distinctly Vi Parsons giving a tongue and my mum interpreting it. And I remember being just in awe of God's divine majesty. That someone speaks in a completely different language, and yet at the same time somebody else can interpret it. And Paul goes on to say at the end of Corinthians, the purpose of those two things, that when you pray out to God in your tongue, it edifies you, it builds you up. And he goes on and he speaks really clearly, he says, but please don't do that to the whole church if there's not going to be an interpretation. Because otherwise it just causes confusion. He was like, interpretation is needed. And he actually goes on to say, which we see again in Pentecost, that when that happens, the Spirit leads to salvation. That the revelatory power of Jesus Christ, when somebody speaks in tongues and somebody else interprets it, leads to salvation. Because that convicts that awe-inspiring miracle where one person speaks in a spiritual language and the other person knows what it means. That is awe-inspiring and brings about salvation. And that's what you get at the beginning of Acts. That's what you get in the apostolic church. And you know, I just want to trace this a little bit back, that right in Pentecost, at the very beginnings of the apostolic movement, I'm just going to read you from the website itself. It says that the children of the revival, as they were known in the really early days, when you've got these miners meeting in this little tiny village of Pentecost. If you've ever been there, from my recollection, it's pretty much a chip shop, that's it, okay? Welsh valleys, very quiet, not much going on. But it said one such group held meetings in the house in Pentecost, UK, in February 1910. They opened a building called the Evangelical Church Pentecost. During the revival, some had experienced the speaking in tongues and prophecy. Out of this, the church began to grow. A miner, D.P. Williams, began to attend some of the services. He had been converted in the revival in 1904 when Mr. Evan Roberts, the revivalist, laid his hands on him. And he then became a well-known preacher, baptized in the Holy Spirit and speaking in tongues. Our early apostolic movement mentions consistently the speaking of tongues. I don't know if you've read Ruth's book that she then published of Lyddon, years and years ago, when it was first there, that little place, where miners travelled from Pentecost down to Lyddon, and they started meeting in a bungalow, in a house, all together. And then one person gave some land, and then they built the church. And they had really vibrant meetings. Again, Ruth comments on the speaking in tongues that was there. And one time, I loved this part in it. There's so much so that this person, some of you would know this name, Mrs. Wade, came round, a neighbour, a non-Christian, because of the noise. And yet, do you know what? She became saved. You know, she walked in that place and was like, what is going on? Yeah, because of the speaking in tongues, because of their worship, because of their praise, she then became saved. And we see the fruit of that here today. We have so much to be thankful for. You know, the Abbots, the Wades, because of that one lady that went round. Then, a few years later, one girl goes back to Pentecost. And she stands in a tent. And she sees this other girl, who is probably 14 years old. And at the age of 13, she sees this girl go up the front and speak out in this language which she does not know. And she sees the Holy Spirit just reveal to this girl, illuminate. She sees deep cry out to deep. And this 13-year-old girl looks at that and thinks, do you know what? I want that. I want this relationship where deep cries out to deep. Somebody else in the tent interprets what that 14-year-old girl is saying. And it makes me think, flipping heck, Jesus Christ is real. It makes me think, do you know what? God is so real. And I was already a Christian by that point. But do you know what? To that day, when people say to me, why are you a Christian? I say, because I have seen things that I cannot deny is the work of Jesus Christ. And that was one of those moments. That girl sold out, speaking in tongues, her being illuminated by the fire from heaven, and then somebody else interpreting it. That spoke to me. And that day I said, I just need that. I want to speak in tongues. And somebody came and prayed for me, and I was expecting maybe these explosions, these fireworks. I quite like drama. That didn't happen. I just liked, a practicality about speaking in tongues. It didn't happen. And someone prayed for me, and I had just a phrase, maybe 3 words. That was it. And I personally felt like a fraud while speaking these words, because I thought, I'm just speaking my mum's tongue. I've heard it so much, I'm just reiterating it. And I was like, but I'll speak it because someone's praying for me, and I'm only 13 years old and I don't want to look embarrassed. And yet I went home after Pentecost, and I remember hearing that my mum speak in tongues, and I thought, no, my tongue is completely different to that. I have got a tongue. And as I had that, I then just started praying in tongues as often as I could to kind of develop that language, because it is a language. God teaches it to you really gently in his Spirit. And so since then, I've had this gift of tongues. And it often kind of bursts out in worship. It explains what I can't explain to God in my earthly language. Or it does spiritual battle for me when kind of earthly weapons fail me. And I just really urge you this morning that if you don't have the gift of tongues, it can really illuminate your walk with Jesus Christ, and it can really reveal Jesus Christ to others. And I just want to go back to this beautiful, historical timeline, so to speak. That in Acts 2, we have these tongues of fire. Hundreds of years later, thousands of years later, we get this spark in goodness knows where in Wales. And this fire then spreads by these little miners that have so much faith through the spiritual giftings down to Lyddon. And the fire grows even more. But what I love is that in that little spark in Wales, there were just a few people met together. And Marcus said 5 million. That's actually 15 million people belong to the Apostolic Church. And I wonder whether these miners in Pentecost, Wales, ever thought that spark would illuminate, would set on fire 15 million hearts for Jesus Christ. We are 120, 150 here today. I wonder if we have a limited expectation of what the small spark in us can do, on what the Spirit can alight in us. We're just a small place in Whitfield. And yet I would love to see what God could do through the Spirit through us. That was pretty much 100 years. It was, exactly. That's why we're celebrating 100 years from what happened in Pentecost to this year. Yeah? I've been in the Apostolic Church for 30 years. Oh, Beth, you look so good for your age. Thanks. Yeah? But guys, that gives us 70 years to get 15 million. 70 years to get 15 more million. Marcus is really smiling on that front row. But when you put it like that, you just think, that's insane. But you know what? Fire, when it meets with fire, spreads like wildfire. Yeah, it does. And with the Spirit, we just shouldn't limit the Spirit. However, James, in chapter 3, verse 6, warns us about what else fire can do. He says, the tongue is also a fire, a world of evil among the parts of the body. It corrupts the whole person, sets the whole course of his life on fire, and sets itself set on fire by hell. You know, fire, yeah, it can illuminate, it can reveal, it can purify, it can also destroy, it can also damage, it can also burn. And we need to definitely know what fire we are releasing. Because you know what? Back at university, I was releasing the wrong type of fire. I was doing a fire where people felt familiar, where people could recognize in me things in themselves. And I wonder whether this church is so on fire that non-believers come in and go, what's happening here? Get me some of that. Where they see God move in this miraculous way and they're like, whoa, that is undeniably God. Or whether they come in and go, oh yeah, gossip. I'm familiar with that. Oh yeah, lies. I'm familiar with that. Oh, that person's slagging off the service. Brilliant, good. I'm familiar with that. Oh, this person's being petty about this. Oh, great. I'm familiar with that. Oh, do you know what? That church is cool. That church is cool. Do you know what? Now, if somebody comes in here and walks away and goes, yeah, that was pretty cool. Man, what an insult that would be. Because they're not going away changed. Because what they're actually saying is that there is something about this church that they are familiar with, that they are happy with, that the true point is, church, that actually we are accommodating unbelievers rather than accommodating the Holy Spirit. And you need to look at your life and you need to say, am I accommodating the world rather than accommodating the Holy Spirit? Am I too afraid to speak in tongues? Because you know what? That will not accommodate the world. It is time that we're not cool, but we are flaming hot. You know, we've been a frozen lake, and God comes with his fire, and he warms it. And he melts it. And when there's more heat, water moves. It bubbles. It overflows. It pours. And we need to overflow. We need to bubble. We need to move. We need to go from being accommodating of the world to really accommodating God's plan for us in the future. You know, and I just really feel this morning that we therefore have to be unified, prepared to have the tongue of fire put into us, a tongue that illuminates and reveals rather than destroys. And that's what God would like to do this morning. And Sue, I'm just going to invite her up with the band. And they're going to play, and I am going to just say there's a couple of things that I want to. Is that first one is that if you know that perhaps your tongue has been more used for destructive purposes than building purposes, I just want you, we don't need to see that, but just pray in your seat. God is here to hold you and to say, that's all right. You know, that's all right. I've forgiven that because that's all right. So if that's you this morning, just call out to God and he will answer you. The second thing is if you've never been, if you've not spoken in tongues, or if it's an old gift and you've not used it, I really would urge you, come out here. I would love to pray for you this morning, to be filled with the Holy Spirit. to speak in tongues. And then lastly, I'll just encourage you all to say to God, what's the next 100 years? Do I believe that the small spark in me, the small spark set alight by your Holy Spirit, could burst into 15 million people? Because one person 100 years ago did believe that. I'm thankful for that legacy. But you know what? I am so excited about what is to come.